There are movies you watch once and forget. Then there are movies that burrow into your brain, that you quote at dinner tables, that you revisit every few years and still find something new. Blazing Saddles is that second kind of film. It has been analyzed, celebrated, and endlessly quoted since it hit theaters in 1974. Critics have written entire essays about its racial satire. Comedy scholars have dissected its fourth wall breaks. Film historians have cataloged its controversies. And yet, after all of that, one of the most important elements of the film has been sitting right there on screen, almost completely overlooked. It is not a hidden cameo. It is not a deleted scene that never made the cut. It is not a behind-the-scenes feud that colored the final product. It is something far quieter and, in many ways, far more powerful than any of those things. It is a performance, one so deliberately understated, so carefully restrained, that audiences have been laughing alongside it for decades without fully understanding what they were watching. Gene Wilder, who played the Waco Kid, eventually confirmed what many instinctively felt but never articulated. The performance was a conscious choice to do the opposite of everything Hollywood expected. In a film built on chaos, absurdity, and screaming social commentary, Wilder walked in the opposite direction. And in doing so, he became the invisible spine holding the entire movie upright. Once you understand what he was doing, and why, you cannot unsee it. Every scene, he isn't changes. Every quiet pause, every dry aside, every still moment in the middle of madness suddenly carries a different weight. The film does not just become funnier, it becomes deeper. So let us go back to the beginning. Back to how Gene Wilder even ended up in Blazing Saddles at all, because that story alone tells you everything you need to know about the man. When Mel Brooks was casting Blazing Saddles in the early 1970s, the role of the Waco Kid, the washed-up, world-weary gunslinger who befriends the new black sheriff of a deeply racist frontier town, was already filled. The actor cast in the part was Gig Young, a name that carries real weight in Hollywood history. Young had won an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor for his work in They Shoot Horses, Don't They? In 1970. He was credible, experienced, and on paper seemed like a reasonable choice for the role. The problem announced itself on the very first day of filming. Young arrived on set visibly unwell. He was sweating heavily, his hands were shaking, and his words came out slurred and disjointed. The initial assumption among some on set was that he was perhaps nervous, perhaps finding his footing. But as the morning progressed, it became undeniable that something was seriously wrong. Young was in the grip of acute alcohol withdrawal, a medical crisis, not a performance choice. And by midday, he had collapsed entirely. Production ground to a halt. Mel Brooks was suddenly staring at a film in crisis. He had a cast assembled, a crew on the clock, a studio watching, and no one to play one of his two lead roles. He needed someone he trusted completely, someone who could step into a character without weeks of preparation, and someone who understood the particular frequency of comedy he was trying to make. He picked up the phone and called Gene Wilder. The two men had worked together before on The Producers in 1967, where Wilder had delivered a performance of such anxious, combustible brilliance that it launched his career into a different stratosphere entirely. Brooks knew what Wilder was capable of. More importantly, he knew that Wilder's instincts could be trusted in pressure situations. What happened next is the part that genuinely surprises people when they hear it. Wilder did not ask for the script. He did not ask about the salary. He did not ask for a breakdown of the character or a summary of the film's plot. According to Brooks, Wilder simply said yes and was on a plane the following morning. He arrived jet-lagged, under-rehearsed, and completely ready. That willingness to show up without a safety net was not recklessness. It was trust. And trust, it turned out, was exactly the right foundation for what the Waco Kid needed to be. Most actors, when dropped into a film already in production, focus on survival. They learn the lines, they hit the marks, they do not rock the boat. Gene Wilder arrived with a different plan entirely. Before he even stepped in front of a camera, he made a specific creative demand of Mel Brooks. It was not about billing or screen time or costume approval. It was about the fundamental nature of the performance itself. Wilder told Brooks that he was not going to play the Waco Kid for laughs. think about what that means in the context of a film like Blazing Saddles. This is a movie that includes a campfire flatulence joke that lasts for nearly a full minute. It is a film where the villain's name, Hedley Lamar, is a running gag about a real Hollywood actress. It is a film that, in its final act, breaks through the literal wall of the movie set and spills out into a neighboring film being shot on the same studio lot. Subtlety was not exactly the dominant creative mode on offer, and yet here was one of its two leads, insisting he was going to play his role with restraint, with stillness, with something approaching grief. Brooks agreed, and that agreement changed the entire texture of the film. What Wilder understood, and this is a thing most people miss, is that comedy needs contrast to breathe. Absurdity becomes funnier when it has something real to press against. If every single element of a film is heightened and exaggerated, the audience calibrates to that heightened reality and it stops being surprising. But if one character in the middle of all that chaos behaves as though the world is genuinely sad, genuinely strange, genuinely exhausting, then every absurd moment around that character becomes funnier by contrast. The Waco Kid is not playing the straight man in the traditional sense. He is not simply the sensible observer who rolls his eyes at the nonsense around him. He is something more specific and more interesting than that. He is a man who has genuinely been broken by the world, who retreated into a bottle because the alternative was facing how much he had lost, and who finds in Sheriff Bart a reason, perhaps the first in years, to re-engage with living. That is a real character arc. Wilder played every beat of it as though it actually mattered. And because it mattered to him, it mattered to us. Let's look more closely at what Wilder actually did on screen, because the details reward attention. The Waco Kid is introduced lying in the upper bunk of a jail cell, barely conscious, apparently nursing a severe hangover. Most actors would have played that scene broadly. Exaggerated gestures, comic timing telegraphed clearly to the audience, the performance essentially winking at us from inside the joke. Wilder did none of that. He played the scene as though it were real. His movements were slow and deliberate, with a particular economy of someone who has learned the hard way not to expend energy unnecessarily. His voice had a quality of exhaustion that went beyond the physical. It sounded like the tiredness of a man who had been disappointing himself for a very long time and had mostly made his peace with it. When he delivered his lines, they came out quietly, without performance, as though he were simply thinking out loud. The famous moment where the kid explains that his hands shake because he was once the fastest draw in the West, and that the world's reaction to that distinction had essentially destroyed him, could easily have been a comedy beat. Instead, Wilder played it with a weariness that borders on confession. There is no boast in his delivery. There is barely even nostalgia. There is only a man describing something that happened to someone he used to be, with a detached clarity of long-accepted loss. That is extraordinary acting. And because it is so understated, so precisely calibrated, audiences have often laughed at the line without realizing they also felt something true. Mel Brooks later said that Wilder brought an emotional intelligence to the role that no one had written into the script. The Waco Kid on the page was a device, a mentor figure, a source of dry humor, a narrative mechanism to help Sheriff Bart navigate the world of the film. What Wilder made of that device was a human being, with a history and a wound and a quiet dignity that the story had not quite earned on its own. There is a shadow that falls across any deep reading of Blazing Saddles, and it is the shadow of Richard Pryor. Pryor was not just a writer on the film. Though his contributions as a co-writer were foundational to the script's voice, its unfiltered engagement with race, its refusal to soften its commentary into something more palatable. Pryor was also originally the intended star. Mel Brooks had championed him for the role of Sheriff Bart from early in the development process, and for good reason. Pryor's raw, electric comedic energy, combined with his lived experience as a black man in America, would have given the character a dimension that no one else could have replicated in quite the same way. Warner Brothers executives blocked the casting. Their stated concerns centered on Pryor's well-documented personal troubles at the time, the controversies that followed him in the press, and a broader institutional nervousness about giving a film with this kind of racial subject matter to a performer as unpredictable as Pryor. The studio wanted the film. They did not necessarily want the full version of the film that Brooks and Pryor would have made together. Cleveland Little stepped into the role and delivered a performance of genuine charm, wit, and intelligence. The film works with him in it, completely, undeniably. But Pryor's absence does not mean Pryor's disappearance. His voice is embedded in the rhythm of nearly every scene. The sharpness of the satire, the refusal to let the audience off the hook, the moments where the comedy tilts into something uncomfortably true, that is all Pryor, writing from the inside of the experience the film was depicting. Gene Wilder, in later years, reflected thoughtfully on what might have been. He and Pryor would eventually work together on Silver Streak in 1976 and Stir Crazy in 1980. And those films revealed a comedic chemistry so natural and so specific that it seemed almost impossible it had not existed on screen before. Wilder understood that the dynamic between his stillness and Pryor's explosive volatility was something rare. That the Waco Kid's quiet sadness next to Pryor's Bart would have produced a different kind of film, not necessarily better, but different in ways that are genuinely fascinating to contemplate. The what-if of Wilder and Pryor in Blazing Saddles remains one of Hollywood's most intriguing, unrealized possibilities. Behind the camera, the production of Blazing Saddles was, by most accounts, a genuinely chaotic experience. The creative ambition was enormous, the studio pressure was constant, and the logistical challenges of making a satirical western on a budget that was never quite big enough for the vision involved were considerable. Mel Brooks operated in his characteristically frenetic mode. High energy, relentlessly improvisational, driven by instinct more than plan. Into this environment, Gene Wilder brought something the production badly needed: steadiness. By the accounts of people who worked on the film, Wilder rarely raised his voice. He did not draw attention to himself during the inevitable small crises of daily production. He showed up prepared, delivered his work, and, in the time between takes, became something of an informal anchor for people around him. Younger or less experienced actors found him approachable and quietly encouraging. He offered suggestions about timing and emphasis not in a didactic way, but through conversation and example. Some crew members later described him as an unofficial director of tone, the person who helped ensure that the balance between outright parody and something more sincere never tipped too far in either direction. There's also something remarkable that began during the downtime of Blazing Saddles, something that had nothing to do with the film being made and everything to do with the film that would come next. During breaks in shooting, Wilder began sharing an idea with Brooks, a premise he had been turning over in his mind. What if there existed a descendant of the infamous Dr. Frankenstein who was so embarrassed by the family legacy that he dedicated his life to distancing himself from it entirely? What if that man was then thrust back into exactly the situation he most wanted to avoid? Brooks was not immediately persuaded. He had a full film to finish. But Wilder was persistent, and eventually he put the idea on paper, writing a draft without any guarantee that it would be produced, purely because he believed in it enough to do the work. When Brooks finally read it, his hesitation evaporated. Young Frankenstein, one of the most beloved horror comedies ever made, was born in the margins of Blazing Saddles. Without that production, without those conversations between takes on a Western backlit, it might never have existed at all. Gene Wilder's investment in Blazing Saddles went beyond performance and beyond the informal mentorship he provided on set. When the film faced its most serious